So in this tutorial we are going to learn vectors in C++ standard template library, which is STL. So if you have studied arrays, we are now going to study about dynamic arrays. So let's suppose you create an array of integers which have 10 elements in it. So when you will create a line of code like this, it basically allocates 5 int sized blocks in memory, right? So once you have created an array, it is allocated in the memory, and you cannot expand or shrink this array. So let's suppose you want to add an 11th element. There is no way to extend the memory blocks or to extend the number of elements that this array can have. And if you want to let's suppose you have added only 1 or 2 elements in this array, so the remaining blocks are still occupied in the main memory, and so if you want to truncate those blocks, then you cannot do that. So once allocated, the array will remain there in the main memory. You cannot shrink it or you cannot extend it, right? So this is just like a static array. So we can make this array dynamic by using vectors, which is provided in the standard template library. So first things first, just include this header file vector. So now we are going to work with vectors, which are dynamic arrays. So when you will create a vector, you will be able to resize it. That means that you do not need to specify the number of memory blocks that it can take. So in order to create a vector, you will have to make a declaration like this. So v1 is the name of our vector, which is of type integer. So you can see that in these symbols I have written int. So now what we are going to do is we are going to insert some elements in the vector. So you can see here I have not defined how many elements are there in this vector, which means that we have the flexibility to increase and decrease the size of this array, of this vector. So this is basically a vector, and you have the flexibility to increase its size, and that's the reason why we are not defining how many elements it can take. So the standard template library in C++ of vector provides some very useful functions which you can use to insert some elements in this vector, or to delete some elements from this vector. So we're going to discuss about some of the functions which STL provides. So let's start with inserting elements in the vector. So we are going to insert first 10 natural numbers inside our vector. So I'm basically running a for loop which runs from 1 to 10, and whenever this for loop will run, we will add the element 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 and 10 inside this vector. In order to do so, you will have to call the predefined function pushback. So this is a very predefined function, and it takes parameter like this. So when you will call this method, which is provided in the standard template library, it actually inserts the element inside the vector. So after this line, you will be able to insert 10 elements inside this vector. So this is basically insertion. And remember that it will insert the element at the end of this vector, right? Not at any random position. So let's now display the contents of the vector. Display contents of the vector. So we will run a for loop, and now we're going to use two functions, which are the begin function and the end function. And basically these two functions return an iterator, which basically points to a particular element in your vector. So begin functions provides you an iterator which points to the beginning of your vector or the first element of your vector. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create an iterator IR which will hold the begin position like this, and we're going to run this for loop until and unless the value of IR is not equal to vector v1 dot end, and we are going to increment the the iterator by 1 so that it will point to the next element. So you can see that in this for loop I have created an iterator which runs from the first element of our vector till the last element, and every time I'm just incrementing the iterator. So there is one more trick that you can do. Instead of writing vector int iterator, you can use the auto keyword, which is basically used to when you want the compiler to automatically know what the type of this variable IR will be, and it basically judges by looking the statement after this equal sign. So that's a basic nice trick, saves some time. So now what I'm just going to do is I'm going to display the content of the vector, right? So since this IR is a vector iterator, so it is basically a reference, a memory reference, which is just basically a pointer reference. So I will use pointer IR to display the value at this memory reference, and then you will be able to display the contents of the vector. So let's run this program and see the output of this program. So first we are going to compile this. So you can see that after running it is displaying the first 10 natural numbers which are there inside our vector. So now we are going to perform some more functions, which is let's display the vector in the reverse order, right? So display the vector in reverse order. So I'm going to use a for loop and I'm going to use an iterator, but this time this iterator will not point to the begin element, rather it will point to the reverse begin, which is our begin function. So I'm going to write here v1 dot our begin function, another predefined function in the STL library. So our begin function is basically reverse begin, which returns an iterator which is a memory reference to the last element of the vector. So there is another function which is our end function, which is reverse end function. So we are going to run this loop v1 dot our end, and then we are going to increment the value of the iterator like this. So you can see here I've used two functions, rbegin and rend functions. These are basically these are already implemented in the standard template library. So rbegin function returns an iterator which is a memory reference to the last element in the vector, and rend points to the first element, which is reverse end, right? So now I'm going to follow the same thing here, which is I will use pointer IR to display the value at this memory reference of the iterator. So let's run this program and see the output of this program. So first I will compile it. So you can see that after running this program, it first displays the contents of the vector and then it displays it in the reverse order 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So another two useful functions we have studied here. Right, so let's study some more functions in the vector. So let's suppose you want to know the size or capacity of the vector. So size basically returns the number of elements which are there inside your vector, and capacity represents the number of bytes they are taking in your vector. For that, we are going to use two functions which are already defined in the standard template library, which is the dot size and the dot capacity functions. So here we are going to display the size of our vector v1 dot size function like this, and then we are going to display the capacity of our vector. So capacity of vector is v1 dot capacity function like this. So these are the two new functions that we have studied, size and the capacity function. Before running this program, let's discuss some more useful functions, which is the dot empty function and the dot resize function. So the standard template library does provide a lot of useful functions that you can use in a vector, right? So first we are going to check if our vector is empty or not using the dot empty function. So if v1 dot empty is not, or let me write it, is equals to false, this means that our vector is not empty. Vector is not empty. So what I'm just going to do is I am going to make a call to the resize function, which basically resizes our vector. So if you want to resize your vector, what you just need to do is you need to call the resize function. So v1 dot resize function, so let's resize it to a value 8 like this. So since our vector has 10 elements, after resizing it should contain only 8 elements, and when you use the resize function, it basically resizes the vectors, but the other two elements, since the vector was having 10 elements initially, they are still allocated in the main memory, and we will use the shrink to fit function to shrink the vector so that it fits all the elements, right? So now let's display the contents of our vector. Display the contents of vector. For that we are going to call this for loop. So let me just copy and paste it from here. Like this, right? So let's run this program and see what will be the impact of the resize function on our vector. So I'm going to compile it first. So you can see here the size of our vector is 10, the capacity is 16. Obviously the vector is not empty, and after resizing you can see that there are only 8 elements instead of 10 elements. So in this manner we can use the resize function, the empty function, the size function, and capacity functions. There are still some more functions which we can discuss. So let's discuss the shrink to fit functions, which basically shrinks the vector so that it fits, so that it will fit all the elements, right? So we will call the v1 dot shrink to fit function, which fits or which shrinks the array, sorry, the vector. So let's discuss the element access in a vector. So what if you want to access a particular element, or you want to access an element which is at some position in your vector, right? So just like arrays, you can do that. You can just do what you were doing in case of arrays. So in order to access the fifth element, you can just use v1, and then this is a reference operator, and then you can write the position of the element, right? So just like arrays, you can access a particular element. There is another way of doing this, which is to use dot add function or add function. So v1 dot add function and specify the position of the element. So there are two ways to do that, right? So now we are going to take a look at some more functions. To return the first element of the vector, you can basically make a call to v1 dot front function. So front function is different from the begin function, because begin function was just giving you an iterator, which is a reference to the first element, but v1 dot front function returns the element, the first element of the vector. So that's the basic difference. So in order to get the last element, you can use v1 dot back function like this, right? So now we are going to see how you can remove an element from the vector at last position. So as we have already seen, the push back function pushes the element at the last position. Similarly, there is a pop back function which pops an element from your vector. So it pops one element from the vector. So after popping, let's display the content of the vector. Right, so we have discussed a lot of functions in this tutorial. Some more functions are also available in our Android application. In the description you can see that. So let's run this program and see the output. Okay, so I will have to save it first. Okay, so it should be cout. So you can see here that after you can access a particular element like this, dot add function, the front value is 1. You can see here the value, the last element is 8. The pop back function will remove 8 and it will display only 7 elements. So this is how vectors work in C++, a very useful library, standard template library to provide the dynamic arrays functionality in C++. So thanks for watching.